I'm sure those really three excellent presentations, there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience that was coming through, and there's more, I'm sure, to share with you, and probably some names to be named and so on along the way. So I'm going to hand it over to you. I won't take the chair's prerogative in this occasion. Questions or comments from the floor? You really do want me to ask the first question? Okay, so the other first questioner gets the right to ask it again.
I always feel compelled to put up my hand like the girly swat I was in high school. We've heard from each of you on the institutional perspectives you have brung to learning about, what you know now from compared to what you were younger. What have you learnt at a kind of a personal level about either your own leadership styles or the way that you approach the rigours of the jobs that you have taken that you wish you knew when you were your younger selves starting out in the public service?
I think that moving from a compliance focus to an enablement focus, people are amazingly wise if you give them a chance. Even the people who are least advantaged, if you create a policy framework that empowers them, they will surprise you, as opposed to if you direct them, they will disappoint you and disappoint themselves. Certainly in New Zealand, there are many examples I could give you, but particularly around Maori. We spent many years saying you have to be like us. It was clearly unwise. And I think today my observation is that if you allow people to have a strong sense of identity, then they're capable of anything. And so public policy should never diminish that. It should at least create a space in which, while we have shared common values or aspirations as a country, and governments are elected to do that, we also have to create that space that allows education and health and other things to be responsive enough to allow those identity issues to be emerge. And by the way, in diversity in politics, that's also flourished in New Zealand. While people who are electoral experts often discuss the merits or otherwise of MMP, some of the great strengths that have come through that change in New Zealand is the diverse nature of leaders who have in many instances been completely and utterly outstanding in the voice they've given to people who were not otherwise heard, and indeed the leadership they've then provided, even though they were saying the same thing. Tiriana Turia, who is just retiring, an outstanding Māori woman leader who has been in politics for 10 years, has said many things that I might have said as a young health minister, but the resonance of having diverse voices in the body politic that then inspire people to a stronger future that is relevant to them is one of the things I've both observed, and I would spend a great deal of time both divesting that opportunity, even if it sometimes goes wrong, because the successes far outweigh the failures.
I think I'd dive in, and I'm going to be a bit of a convert here and say one of Terry's ideas I recall from his time at PMC was around the need for senior public servants in Canberra to get out and get state experience and state people to come to Canberra. My reflection is that's come for me quite late in my career. Wish it had, on reflection, come a bit earlier, and would happily create opportunities for senior public servants from Canberra to come down for 12 months and find out what it's like to have 45,000 teachers get up and go to work every day, or 15,000 police officers, or, spend $15 billion on your health system with everything that goes with that, and own the problem of state economic development in a way that a state government has to. So I think my reflection would be some of those employment barriers that we inadvertently put in place around superannuation and those sorts of things have not worked in our favour to create a cadre of public sector leaders that truly understand the nature of the business, that are deeply imbued with the full sweep of public administration, because it is a huge enterprise that we're all engaged in, but true understanding actually comes from really getting in and getting your hands dirty at all levels, which I now appreciate and wish I'd reflected on much earlier in my career.
When I retired from PM&C, I think I was probably the longest serving public sector CEO in Australia. I'd been a CEO of 5 organisations over 24 years and I'd never been sacked. And people would invariably ask me, well, how did I manage to pull that off? Because I'd worked for both sides of politics and everything. Well, firstly, by not giving speeches such as the one I gave today. But that's not the point. But I think the critical thing was teams. In every one of those organisations, particularly at the top end of the organisation, the critical thing was the quality of the leadership team. And this isn't to say that leadership is only at the top. Leadership is exercised at all levels within an organisation. And in constructing a leadership team, which I always tried to do consciously, I was always after people with very diverse backgrounds so that there was not a similarity between everybody such that groupthink emerged. And there are, when I look around, quite a number of people in this room that I've worked with, so I hope they're not going to contradict me, but I was also asked what was the thing that I missed most when I left each one of those organisations and indeed when I retired. And to be truthful, Jenny, it wasn't ministers and it certainly wasn't teenage political advisors, or they had fond feelings for all of them. It was the teams that I'd worked with. I really, really, really liked working with the people that I worked with. And it's not as if I always had the choice of who I worked with. It's just that I chose some, I inherited others, and some of the people in this room that I've worked with know exactly what I mean by that. But the point is, how do you come to an understanding with everybody that's part of that team about where you're trying to go and what role each individual will play in getting the whole group to that point, and then reaching a point where, if you're the head of the organisation or if you're the next level down, you can make right judgments about what you can just leave with other people to settle and keep out of their way, because if you can do that, that magnifies hugely the capacity of the given organisation to deliver on reform. And my experience in Canberra most recently, having worked in the Commonwealth 3 times, my experience in Canberra recently was a bit unsettling, because I felt that some secretaries were really good at constructing and working with teams, and some weren't and didn't even realise that it might be an issue. And so command and control just doesn't work with the sort of people that all of us want to be or want to employ. There's got to be another way. The techniques are all important, but if you don't have the culture of teams and trust within the team and an ability to all agree on where you're trying to get to, it won't work.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I was at an event not long ago.
Could you give your name and
sorry,
affiliation?
Tanya Smith from Nous Group. I was at an event a while back, and former Prime Minister Bob Hawke was pushing back on the notion that, in fact, the world has got more complex and the policy challenges that we're dealing with are more complex than they were, say, in the 80s. And so I was thinking about the presentation we had from Cass Sunstein this morning, where he was talking about simplification as being a key concept in better regulation, and wondering, to get back to this topic, whether you think that we have made our work and our challenges much more complex than they need be, or is it really that everything has got a lot more difficult, and that's what's made the role of public sector leaders so much more important and so much more challenging?
Could I, because I've thought about this issue a bit, so if I could go first and then leave you with a moment, as I had myself just a second ago, to think about it. Firstly, I think many of the problems are different to what they were. So the problems in the 80s were, how do you change the macroeconomic settings and engage in a variety of reforms that would serve a purpose of that sort? That was sort of the first wave of reform. The second wave of reform was competition reform and largely microeconomics focused, but with as the Productivity Commission eventually assessed it as, a big impact on growth within the economy. And the current wave of reform is a human capital-based reform with some more regulation reform and things like that. Different analytical techniques were required for each of those different reforms, but my second point would be that what happened in the 30 years that those three waves of reforms spanned is that the digital revolution made vastly more data available and thus facilitated a huge amount of analysis that couldn't have been afforded or dreamed of, which can have the effect of making everybody cautious about making big decisions because they're never sure that enough analysis has been done to surface all the problems and make it as low risk as possible, which of course, as Jenny said, is not what you should be seeking to do anyway. And I think there have been some prime ministers in recent times that were in this country who were a bit overwhelmed with the sheer volume and complexity of data that you can now bring to bear, and that caused them hesitancy in making decisions which in Bob Hawke's time their equivalents would have found much easier to handle.
I think I'd come in at around expectations. So I think reflecting back on the round of Hawke and Keating reforms, a lot of those reforms to public administration were about basically breaking up. There were 14,000 staff in the Transport Department when Bob Hawke started. We owned a shipping company, an airline, we owned all the airports, you know. A lot of the reforms were making public administration, how we organised ourselves, fit for purpose. I think we actually do a pretty good job at the basics down the stovepipes now. But what's happening to us, I think, is that we're way now off beam with where community expectations are. And it seems that what the community and the politicians that represent the community want from us is to be able to deal with these wicked problems. Now, they're wicked because they don't have a solution. They're wicked because we only ever get approximately there. And so now we're being, well, certainly in Victoria, you know, we're being told, well, you really need to do better at domestic violence. Well, domestic violence isn't about policing. Domestic violence might be about a bit urban design. It might be about the role of women and economic empowerment for women. It might be about the education of men and their identity in society. Those are really complicated things for a public service to go. If you said to us, go away and fund a women's shelter, we can do that. We can do it very, very well. The community now seems to be saying to us, go and do better at domestic violence. Go and do better at vulnerable children. These are very kind of amorphous things that they're not amenable to a market. You know, commissioning and market thinking might enable us to do some bits of that problem. So I do think we're being called to a sort of a higher level now, which is making the reform challenge even more complicated. We know how to do the other stuff. We can actually build roads. In Victoria, we're very good at it. We can do all of those things in public administration. It's the other stuff. It's where does the real public value reside that we're now being challenged over. And I do think that is more complicated, that we are being asked to perform at a higher standard.
It's an interesting question. Look, both politicians and the public service are charged with trying to shape the future. And that's a challenge. I think the reality for those of us who live in New Zealand and Australia in a still thankfully growing global economy is the reality that developed societies like us are going to have less of the more, and developing economies are going to have more of the more as it grows. So what does that mean at home for this conversation? And I think expectations, particularly in the very buoyant last decade, through which both of our economies have thrived but not necessarily had to see this trend coming of this big shift. There are 2 or 3 things that I think are going to have to occur, and many of you are going to have to lead it. While we've talked probably for 30 years in this growth phase about expansion, in truth, the middle class has captured the welfare state. And political leaders struggle to develop the will and capacity to claw that out, so that the resources are available for some of the great conversations. And when I say welfare state, corporate welfare in Australia is far further alive and well than it is in New Zealand, for example. We grappled with that and the difficult rows that it invoked in the 90s. I can remember the car industry and how hell would freeze over before it would change. Interestingly, once the decision was made, human and financial capital flowed to where it could get a return. So to come back to the question of what is the role of the public service in shaping the future, the question is what are the resources you've got in the time you live, and who's commandeered them, and where do they need to be released to? So that the financial resource is an enabling factor. But I think the other question around this issue of complexity is I think there's a notion that government can fix things that they clearly cannot. And if I'd been given $1 in my whole political career for every time someone said, well, the government should do something about this, it's usually a mask, by the way, for us all finding it either too hard or too complicated or just a bit overwhelming. And often it's the question of our getting out of the road. And I'm not just meaning markets, coming back to family violence. These are very hard, complex conversations. But the truth of the matter is women can control their fertility. And that's an anthropological/societal fact. And it has made big changes around the relationship of women and men and expectations in society. And we need to talk about that more because, it is the reality of our modern world. And how we then allow society to air those views, accommodate them and find ways to move forward while still achieving the growth that Joe Hocking and others were talking about yesterday around more women in the workforce. These are complicated questions. I want to conclude by this business of shaping the future requires us to be honest. And it's a very hard thing for politicians alone to do. But also you have to trust communities and families. And sometimes they get it wrong, but if you actually can get the public policy setting right and trust them to make some of the decisions themselves, I think we could surprise ourselves around how, if we consult properly and listen carefully to what might make a material difference as to how they'd like resources to flow to them, it may not be how we think or what the priorities we think are good for them, but rather what they feel are missing, that if they were allowed to get involved in that catch-up or investment, that it might make a difference. And that's a very hard space for public policy. You've got to share. And frankly, the Rear Vision Mirror is unhelpful in this space because it's a forward view that you're talking about. There's very little analysis I used to be overjoyed when people would come into my office with ideas. I had commentary on history in every goddamn example you could hope to find about what we did 15 years ago. And yet, prospectively, the number of public servants who are prepared to put their name and their signature on a paper that was seriously in you have to take off this person in order to give it to that, and the payback for society will be X, Y, Z. I'm sure the political leaders of today would be overjoyed if some of you were prepared to shape the future or help them shape the future in that way. And I still think that's the political challenge of today. We know a lot about economics, but we actually know a lot about behaviour too. And the middle class is still very good at capturing a system that was never designed for them. And until we're prepared to call that out, and I say the welfare state, the middle class, the corporate class, and start saying, where does tomorrow exist and what are the issues that deserve the attention of you as you serve the public, those who are brave enough to answer that question will shape the future.
Andrew raised the question of enduring reform as being a key success factor. I suppose the other one is that it's actually beneficial. You know, the word reform gets misused a lot, and doesn't it really? But assuming it's beneficial, I'd be interested in the comments of our other two speakers on what you see as the keys to enduring reform when you think back. I mean, Australia's just been through a process of major so-called reforms that have not been enduring. Two of them are taxes. One's the mining tax, the other's the carbon tax. I mean, they fail Andrew's test. Industrial relations regulatory changes seem to be temporary. The national broadband network is being majorly revamped and so on. So any just thoughts about, you know, what you see as the keys to enduring beneficial policy change that transcends political, you know, to governments, and
Look,
we have
I
got
think,
good examples of it.
I think in New Zealand, one observation, and it may be relevant here, is around the comment of language. So in my generation, for a range of reasons, we corporatised those big public departments that you referred to, and then in some instances brought them into state-owned enterprises and in due course either partially or fully privatised a number of them. And so the commentary was around exactly that, asset sales and so on. And we never succeeded until actually Finance Minister English, I think, is getting the closest to the era that I've observed in getting the rhetoric right, where he's saying, look, sometimes a generation has to invest because the scale of the investment's larger than the private sector would deliver, and so it's a time where, whether it's power or infrastructure, that you can justify public expenditure. But the question of whether that's a retained, a held asset, or so it's a hold or sell in order to reinvest in the next generation of innovation is not the language or culture of, you know, public investment and holding of assets or relinquishing them. We are starting to move very slowly through the Treasury to a, you know, so if there's a portfolio of assets owned by the state today, and even though these are governed by individual boards to get the commercial dynamics of performance right, should there be effectively a holding company concept, which is technical, but that the strategy around it is this an invest, hold or sell? So maybe we should have in either a state or a country, you know, 7 or 10 or $20 billion worth of assets owned by the public interest, but that there's a dynamic that asks whether it's the rollout of infrastructure, broadband, or what is the enabling investment of a generation that would justify the sale of some assets that can be equally well run by the private sector to release capital. Families do it every day. And if we were able to explain why one invests, then holds or sells down in the same context as families make those decisions, I think that there would be a far better and more rational discourse. And I think that would help you know, get further clarity. So that it's a language question. It's easy for me to say in retrospect, I wish I'd been as wise then as I am in this observation. But certainly I'm noticing the public is much more accepting of, yes, you know, we relied on it, but actually it doesn't matter who owns it as long as it performs. And by the way, releasing that capital can allow it to move to a far more productive piece of the economy. And I think that's a dynamic conversation that both the public sector and the private sector and the media, dare I say, need to think about. It's an intergenerational opportunity that you should be for rather than something that we should just rail against.
Terry, the keys to making reform stick?
Several points. Firstly, the public needs to have been persuaded that there is a given major problem where something's got to change, or indeed a whole series of problems, but we live in a democracy and it's just not possible for governments these days to say, well, we've been going this way, but we're now going to go that way. The public has to be persuaded that there's a reason lying in a problem why we'll make that shift. Secondly, having got the people to understand that there's a problem, they have to be persuaded of the nature of the reform and its benefits, its winners and losers, and for those who are losers, that there's some great reason in the national interest that that will be accepted. If you do those two things, there's a fair chance that you'll get to the characteristics of nearly all the successful major reforms in Australia in the last 30 years, which is implicit or explicit bipartisan support. So apart from what was done in the Hawke and Keating years, the other big reformer of the Hawke and Keating period was John Howard as opposition leader, because Howard went along with so much reform because he believed it was right and the national interest. And he didn't, as a rule, regress to opportunistic populism as a means of opposing the government of the day. Labor then didn't return the favour when John Howard was in government when it came to the GST, for example, but nonetheless that endured, and upon taking office, Kevin Rudd didn't even give a moment's thought to reversing the GST-based reforms. So public understanding about a major problem that's got to be dealt with, why it has to be dealt with and what's going to be done will give you democratic credibility, legitimacy if you wish to use that old-fashioned word, and that's the key to getting bipartisan support, which means that you don't see things regressing into unpalatable populist fights, which we know from attitudes research, basically the public hates. They hate it, and they hate the people who engage in it. They don't trust them. So I can't see why politicians don't generally have the insights that Hawke, Keating and Howard achieved in terms of the preconditions for reform, if, as is the case with me, I believe quite strongly that they had the ingredients for making it work.
Yep, sounds sensible to me. Andrew, did you want to make any further comment?
If you think about the sort of the polarisations around the reforms you mentioned, Gary, that haven't endured, I think it's true that Terry's point that the public weren't convinced there was a problem. Certainly, there are no rewards for a senior public servant that goes to a leader and finds a solution to a problem the public don't know they have. And so this tilling the ground, and Australians at the moment are immensely resistant to the notion that we have to double our level of productivity growth. I think many people hear it and think it's work choices, and it isn't. But unless we do, our standard of living falls. So nobody should leave the room without understanding our standard of living is going to fall unless the rate of productivity growth increases substantially to a level it hasn't achieved since World War II. We've really got to get that conversation happening. And when we do, the public will then start to respond and say, OK, well, what does that mean? But I don't think we can leave it to the politicians because I think debate's too polarised. It has to be people like us. We've got to get out there.
Could I make a point on what Andrew has just said? My observation would be that at any one time in the press gallery in Canberra, there would be between 6 and 10 really influential journalists who are also informed and intelligent and could understand things in the way that people familiar with policy would understand things. If I can, I don't want to be patronising, but if I can just put it in those terms, and if there's anybody in this room that feels insulted at this point, I'll apologise objectively later on.
I might just mention by the by that we had Laura Tingle as our breakfast
She's one
speaker.
of them. She's fabulous. Anyway, in the Hawke and Keating years, what I've been told by one or two of the journalists who were in that small group at that time is that both Hawke and Keating made arrangements, and I suppose other ministers did the same thing, to in effect license senior public servants to call journalists in and brief them on background and with the minister's authority about what was behind some body of reform, and then if the journalist wanted a quote, they'd get it from the minister. Now, as it happened, when I was in the Premier's Department in Victoria, and we're engaging on putting together what became known as the National Reform Agenda, which sort of John Howard supported but Kevin Rudd really embraced. And we put out a whole series of papers, and the rule was every paper had to be about a real problem, and it had to be no longer than you could read on a plane flight from Sydney to Melbourne. And I hired a lot of people from professional services firms and all sorts of places, academics to do the work, and these were very high quality, and we started releasing them and we had no impact. You know, like nothing. And one of the journalists who'd actually come to work in the Premier's Department for a while said, well, look, this is what Hawke and Keating did, and so he went off to people in the Premier's office and explained it to them, and they authorised it. And so we started doing exactly what senior public servants have been authorised to do in the Hawke and Keating period. And all of a sudden, Steve Bracks was a hero of national reform. The Fin Review was editorialising, it seemed they were doing it every second week, about these wonderful ideas. The Australian did it, the Age did it, and occasionally even the Herald Sun. And so this was a constructive, apolitical use of the resources of the public service with the credibility, a particular sort of credibility that they have, which is different to that which, say, a group of ministers have, to take influential journalists on a journey. And with them understanding it better, they could then make sense of what, in this case, the state's Premier and Treasurer were saying and report it with insight and often even acclamation. And so there are 100 tricks like that if you want to get up reform in the context of the Australian democracy. And I think one of my criticisms of the political advisor class is that their composition is different now to what it used to be. So there aren't any more, as is the case in most other countries, a leveling or leavening of people with experience of the business of government and public policy, often on secondment out of the public service, in those offices. They don't understand, therefore, how to use, as an office, all the levers that are available to a minister and a government when they're in office. And thus, they can often be left trying to help ministers sell stuff with one arm and one leg tied behind them, and the poor old minister hobbling along, doing the best with sometimes a group of journalists that have become quite cynical and just aren't listening.
Well, we'll take that as a segue into our final session today, which is on the skills and capabilities needed of public servants and senior public servants in the 21st century. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I think you'll agree with me that that was really great, and I'll ask you to help me thank Terry Moran, Andrew Tongue and Dame Jenny Shipley. Thank you.